Hi everyone, this is Mr. Davis here. This is the first of our lessons on the musculoskeletal system. One of the more straightforward starter tasks that you're going to be given in A-level PE. I'd like you to draw a stick man, label in the key bones of the body. Once you've done that, can you identify the different types of joint that are found in the body? So specifically looking at those 5 parts of the body listed there: the shoulder, the elbow, the hip, the knee, and the ankle. Pause the video, complete that task, take 5 or 10 minutes to do that, and then join me on the next slide when you're ready. So this diagram shows us a number of different bones throughout the body, specifically looking at the arms and the legs, which are important obviously for movement. Any that you haven't got, can you please note down? Make sure you've got the spelling correct. There are 1 or 2 other bones that we're going to need to look at in due course, but for now, just make sure that you've got a good understanding of the names and locations of the bones shown on this image. Pause the video if you need to, and I will join you on the next slide shortly. Okay, so the next task. Can you identify the different types of joint found at these 5 points of the body? Which type of joint is at the shoulder, the elbow, the hip, the knee, and the ankle? Hopefully you can remember some of that from GCSE. Once you've done that, can you identify the articulating bones at each joint, which is essentially meaning, can you identify the bones that meet and move at those different points of the body? Can you draw a basic diagram of each of those joints, labeling the articulating bones? Take a few minutes to complete that task, pause the video if you need to, and then we'll check back in. So this diagram shows you a range of different joints. The top 2 are the key ones that we're concerned with for A-level PE, so the ball and socket joint and the hinge joint. As you can see, there's 2 particular points of the body that are relevant for ball and socket, and that is the shoulder joint and the hip joint. And then 3 that you're looking at in terms of hinge joints: the elbow, the knee, and also the ankle. The ankle is slightly different in terms of its structure to the elbow and the knee, but it's still classified as an ankle joint. I suggest you just make a note of that diagram. Don't worry about all these other ones. We don't need to know these, but certainly focusing on those 5 key parts of the body. Just make sure you've got them clearly labeled, and we'll look to move on to the next task. So for each of the different joints that were previously highlighted, you need a basic diagram. Okay, it doesn't have to be an incredible piece of artwork, but it does just have to be accurate and show the different bones. On this particular one, you don't need to worry about the muscles because that's not something we're looking at in this lesson, but you do need to be able to identify these key bones. Pause the video if you need to, just make sure you've got a fairly accurate diagram there, and we'll add the labels on in a minute. Or you can add the labels on now, and then we'll check them in a minute. Same thing for this. So have a think about which joint type this is. Where's this found in the body? You need to be clear on these bones here. And you've got this type of joint. Where's this found in the body? You need to be clear on these. You can add this in if you want. That's a protective bone, slightly different, doesn't move during the movements. This type of joint, what are those 2 main bones here? You don't need to worry about the specific shape here, as long as you've got a fairly decent diagram. Something like this, which shows the different joints. And then finally, you have this joint. Hopefully that's fairly obvious where that is, and you need to identify these bones here, okay? Right. Hopefully you've got some good diagrams noted down. We'll just check your answers against this slide here. So for the elbow, humerus runs down here, and you've got the radius and the ulna running down here. Often these 2 are mixed up. Have a think about how you're going to be able to remember which one's which. So the U in ulna, U for underneath. So the radius is on top, ulna is underneath. You've got the knee joint here, so you need to make sure that you know about the femur that runs down from the hip down towards the knee. Tibia is here, your main shin bone, And the fibula is the one that runs down parallel to it. Protective bone here is the patella, otherwise known as what? So that's your kneecap. Then got the hip joint. Again, don't worry too much about the specific outline of the bone, but that's your pelvis there. That is a ball and socket joint. It meets the top of the femur. Got your shoulder joint. So you've got your humerus here that runs up from your elbow towards your shoulder. That connects into your scapula. Clavicle, otherwise known as your collarbone, just attaches on there. And then finally, you've got your ankle joint. So that's a very complicated set of bones in your ankle. The main ones you need to be aware of: your tibia, like I said, your main shin bone, fibula that runs down alongside it, and then your talus, which is here, essentially like your ankle bone. Then you've got your tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Okay, just make sure that you've got 5 accurately labeled diagrams, and we will move on. So the next part of this work concerns joint actions. Again, hopefully this is something that you're going to be familiar with for the most part from GCSE. How many of the definitions can you remember though? Go through the list, write down the correct definition for each one of them. Any that you're not sure of, obviously, you can either just wait and make a note of it, or ideally maybe do a bit of research. Try and make sure you've got a definition for each of them. Pause the video here. Right, just as I give you a clue before I give you the answers, these are the answers, but they're all mixed up. So that one doesn't link with that one doesn't link with that one doesn't link with that one, etc. Can you just check against the descriptions and make sure that the ones that you've got written down are accurate? Which ones do you need to move around to make sure that you've got it correctly defined? What you should have is this list here. So flexion, decrease in angle of a joint. So otherwise you're bending, like you're bending your elbow. That's what flexion is. Extension is the increase, so essentially straightening. So from a flex position, as if you were at the top of a bicep curl, and if you lowered the weight back down, that would be extension. Abduction is movement away. So if you think of something, it's a bit grim, but if you think of something or someone being abducted, they're being taken away, that's movement away from the midline of the body. So if you hold your arm down by your side and move it away, that is abduction. Adduction is the opposite, so movement towards the midline of the body. So if you hold your arms up and out to the side and then slowly lower them down, that is adduction. You're adding it to the midline of your body. And this is a new one, hyperextension. So that's the increase in the angle at a joint beyond 180 degrees. So for example, if you have shoulder hyperextension, as you move your arm up in front of you, that's shoulder flexion. You move that shoulder, you move the hand down towards your side, that's shoulder extension. And as you continue to push that arm backwards, so beyond 180 degrees, that would be hyperextension. Horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction are two that are new to us. So we'll just take a quick look at them. Movement of the limb forwards while it's held in a parallel to the ground. So if you bring your arm up and out to the side, what movement's that? It's movement away from the midline of the body. So that would be abduction. Now from that position with your arms up and out to the side, if you then bring them across in front of you, so it's movement across and in front of you, that is horizontal adduction. If you then move the arms back towards that sideways position, that's what horizontal abduction is. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, where do they occur? So those are the two movements that happen at the ankle. Plantar flexion is the pointing of the toes down away from the knee. So if you point your toes down, or if you rise up onto the balls of your feet, or you point your foot away, point your toes away to strike a volley in football, that's plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is just the opposite, so bringing those toes back up towards the knee. So just make sure that you've got all of those joint actions noted down. Once you've done that, we need to think about which joint actions occur at each of those different joints that we were looking at previously, and ideally link them into sporting examples. So just pause the video here, try and make a few notes, make sure you've got all of those definitions down, try and think about which joint actions can occur at a different joint, and possibly list a few sporting examples. Okay, we'll pick it up again shortly. So this is the main part of the lesson now, which concerns movement analysis, where we've got to bring all that information about the skeletal system, about different bones, about different joint actions. We've got to bring all of that together and link it in to our work on planes and axes. So one of our old favorites from GCSE. Okay, just make a note of the title, learning objective and keywords. Once you've done that, we'll move on to the next slide. So planes and axes. So I am going to just go through this briefly. I know it was something we looked at in GCSE, but I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on it before we move on to some of the more technical work. So planes and axes concerns movement. Okay, all movement happens through a plane. So imagine this pink sheet here. It's gone through the middle of my body, split me in half. If I was only able to move through that plane, so in this direction here, or this direction here, I couldn't lean from side to side. I couldn't move the plane. I could only move forwards and backwards. Okay, so for example, on that one, the sagittal plane, the only movements that I can do through that plane are forwards and backwards. If I was to move in any other direction, I'd be moving through a different plane. Now, most sporting movements, you move through a combination of different planes, but specific techniques and specific movements you can isolate. Okay, so in this first instance, the sagittal plane is movement forwards and backwards. How does that split my body? So it splits my body from left to right. You can see clearly here, this is the right side of his body, this is the left side of his body. The plane has split his body from left to right, and he's only able to move forwards and backwards through that plane. You need to try and do the same thing for the frontal plane and the transverse plane. So just pause the video and have a go at that. So these are the descriptions. You've got to try and match them up. I think I've actually done them in order, so it shouldn't be too difficult. So we'll move on through the sagittal plane. Forwards and backwards movement divides the body from left to right. Frontal plane, as you can see here, if you were only able to move through the plane, you'd only ever be able to move left to right, sideways movements, because the plane divides the body from front to back. So imagine you're walking along a tightrope, sideways, sidestepping across the tightrope. Couldn't move anywhere in any other direction. That sideways movement is divided from front to back. And then finally, the transverse plane, a bit of a tricky one to show the movement here. If you could only move through that plane, you'd only be able to rotate or turn around. Okay, and that divides the body from top to bottom. So you've got forwards and backwards, sideways, and sort of rotational type movement. Okay, the first step to establishing which plane and which axes and which joint action is always going to be, what's the type of movement? Is it forwards and backwards? In which case you know it's going to be a sagittal plane. Is it sideways type movement, which is always going to be frontal? Or is it a rotational type movement, which is always going to be through the transverse plane? That's always going to be your first step, so make sure you remember that. Now, the next stage of this is matching each plane to an axis. So you've got the sagittal plane on the first one here, which splits the body from left to right. You've also got this axis, so like this rod that splits the body, and the rod runs parallel to the plane, but it's not the sagittal plane and the sagittal axes that work together. So you've got to work out which are the pairings. So movement always happens through a plane, but you always rotate around an axis. So a good way of thinking about this is this gymnastics performer here spinning round the bar. Essentially, they're moving forwards and backwards, depending on which direction they've set off in, but they're going to be rotating around the bar. Now, whilst this one's obviously out in front of him, because you can't do gymnastics with a great big bar running through you, you can see which one of these axes, so you've got this one running here, you've got this one running here, you've got this one running here. which one of those matches up to this gymnastics performer? So what you should be able to see is the movements from forwards to backwards. So we know the direction of the movement, so it must be sagittal plane. In terms of rotating round an axis, hopefully you can see that it would be the transverse axis. So this bar that runs along here is essentially rotating around that. So it would be the sagittal plane with the transverse axes. So we're going to try and match all of them up now. So sagittal plane matches up to the transverse axes. Frontal plane to the sagittal axis, transverse plane, what we're going to call the longitudinal axes. Okay, just make sure you've got a note of that. It's quite complicated terminology. Hopefully we'll be able to simplify it and make sure that you can apply this complex topic to various sporting examples. So we'll take them one at a time. On this one, we've already said it's the sagittal plane and transverse axes. What I want you to do is try and think of other sporting examples where that same sort of movement takes place. So in what other sporting examples can you think of forwards and backwards movement? Pause the video, make a list. So there are lots of examples for this one, but for example, you could have a forwards or a backwards roll. So again, you establish the direction of the movement first, forwards or backwards, then you can just match it up to the axes. So as soon as you know which plane it is, you can just pair it up to the axes. That's the easiest way to tackle this topic. Another example, slightly different, would be something like a bicep curl. Okay, so the movement is definitely not going out to the side. Nothing's being rotated. So it must be a forwards and backwards movement. Okay, even though it's essentially a kind of a lifting action, it's still happening just up in front of you, and then you're dropping it back down towards the side. Okay, so forwards and backwards movement. So as soon as you know that, you know it must be the transverse axes as well. The next one, so we've got the frontal plane. So this is the second pair that's linked into sideways movement. So can you think of other sporting examples where the movement goes to the side? Pause the video, make a list. So things like fielders in cricket reaching out to the side to catch a ball. Okay, the movement is sideways. It's not moving forward. It's not rotating, so it's out to the side. As soon as you've established that it's sideways movement, you must know that it's then the frontal plane, and the sagittal axis is always paired up with the frontal plane. Another example would be a goalie reaching out to the side to save a penalty. So as the arm moves up to the side, what type of movement is that? That's abduction, so movement away from the midline of the body. And then finally, you've got these rotational type movements. So as soon as you see anything where there's twisting and turning and rotating, recognize that that's the direction of the movement. That must be the transverse plane. If it's the transverse plane, we know it must be the longitudinal axes. Can you think of any other sporting examples where that type of movement might occur? So for instance, an ice skating spin is a good example. But you can also have things like golf players rotating their hips as they swing to hit the ball. Tennis players that rotate as they hit the shot. But these two are certainly probably the two best examples to use. As soon as you see the direction of the movement, they're not moving forwards or backwards. They're not moving side to side or left to right. So it must be transverse plane, longitudinal axes. Now, in terms of remembering it, it's quite tricky. So the first thing that you do is establish the direction of the movement. That should be straightforward. It will give you a couple of diagrams. It will say from this position A to this position B, which plane and which axis is it? Now, the first thing to do is establish what the direction of the movement is. Once you've done that, you then need to try and link it in to the pair of planes and axes. And there's three pairs. The first pair is going to be sagittal transverse, which is sagittal plane, transverse axis. So the plane is always going to come first in the pairs. Sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane. Then you just work out which axis is linked into it. So sagittal plane, transverse axes, that's the first one. Anything that's forward and backwards, right, that must be the first pair. So that's sagittal plane, transverse axes. Anything that's side to side, frontal plane, that must be sagittal axes. Finally, anything that's a sort of rotational, turning, spinning type movement, that's the third pair. So you've got forwards and backwards, sideways, and rotational type movement. Now, in terms of remembering that, you're probably not going to remember sagittal plane, transverse axes, frontal plane, sagittal axes, transverse plane, longitudinal axes. That's quite a lot of information. What you should be able to remember are little phrases like the one we came up with for GCSE PE, which is silly teachers force students to learn. Okay, that in itself doesn't mean an awful lot, but what it tells you is ST, sagittal plane, transverse axes, FS, frontal plane, sagittal axes, TL, transverse plane, longitudinal axes. Okay, if you want to come up with your own rhyme to try and remember it, then by all means do, but this is one that seems to have stuck in the head of lots of GCSE students. So, and it helps because you establish the direction of the movement and then you establish which of the parents it is. Even if your understanding of the topic is quite limited and you don't quite understand the reasons why those things are as they are, for the most part, you won't need to explain it. You just need to identify the planes and the axes. What are the correct pairs linked into that type of movement? Okay, the other thing that we then need to be able to do is link the planes and axes to the type of the joint actions and where those joint actions happen. So take a minute to read through this. These are the different parents, 1, 2, 3, with a sporting example. But for each of these parents, which movements can happen through that plane and through that axes? So you've got all these different movements listed here. Try and match them up. So take a minute, pause the video, think of the direction of the movement that's happening, and look at the examples because they will help. Then try and work out which of these joint actions or movements, which of these is going to link in. None of them have them all. Some of them have a lot of them. Some of them only have a couple of them. So have a think, pause the video, have a go at it, try and match them up, and then we'll pick it up again in a minute. So we'll take it one at a time. So for the first one, anything forwards and backwards. So those movements, so that flexion and extension. So imagine doing the bicep curl. Okay, that flexion of the arm bending up and that extension of the arm straightening, dropping down. You can also have that hyperextension where the arm increases, the angle of the joint increases beyond 180 degrees. So you're pulling that arm back from the side even further back. That's hyperextension, but it's still moving in a forwards or backwards motion. Plantar flexion, so pointing the toes forward and down. Dorsiflexion, pointing the toes back up towards the knee. All of those movements can happen through the sagittal plane. As soon as you know it's the sagittal plane, you should remember then it's the transverse axes. Second one, so anything sideways. So which two movements are linked into sideways movements or joint actions in that direction? Adduction. What's adduction? Movement towards the midline of the body. Abduction, so as if you're abducting something, you're taking it away. That's movement away. So if you picture yourself or give it a go, stand up and kind of, you don't have to actually do the cartwheel, but imagine you're going to do the cartwheel. The first thing you probably do is raise that arm up and out to the side. That's abduction. Okay, then the final one, the transverse plane and the longitudinal axis. So this type of rotational movement. Now, when we looked at this before in GCSE, we simplified it as just being rotation as the joint action. Okay. What we're going to look at now are these two different terms here, horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. So if you bring your arms up out to the side, that abduction, hold your arms up and away from you in the kind of shoulder level, and then you bring your hands out in front of you, as if you're going to dive into a swimming pool. That movement across and in front of you is horizontal adduction. As you bring your arms back then from that central position back out to the side, that's horizontal abduction. So two different terms that you've got to remember there. Now what I want you to do is complete a table to show the different joint actions that are possible at each of these joints. So essentially we've covered this already in a different kind of way by looking at the joint actions and the planes and axes. But now what you need to do is try and link it all together in a table. So for instance, at the shoulder joint, which joint actions are possible there? Same thing for the elbow, the hip, the knee and the ankle. Give that a go. Pause the video, have a go at it and then pick it up again in a minute. Okay, this is hopefully more simple than maybe it sounds, because the shoulder and the hip are essentially the same type of joint, so it'll be the same type of joint action, even though they're located at different parts of the body. So those are all of the different movements that can happen at those parts of the body. So you've got flexion and extension, so that's just bending your arm, raising the arm up in front of you, that's shoulder flexion. Bringing the arm back down is shoulder extension, and pulling the arm back down behind you, that's shoulder hyperextension. Same thing with the hip. So if you bring your leg up out in front of you, that's hip flexion. Bring the leg back down, that's hip extension. Pull the leg right back as if you're going to strike a football or preparing to strike a football, that's hip hyperextension. Abduction and adduction, movement to the side. So movement away from the midline of the body, which is abduction, movement back towards the midline of the body, which is adduction. Both occur at the shoulder and the hip, and this idea of horizontal adduction and abduction. So again, bring the arm out to the side in itself is abduction, but then as you bring it across towards the front of the body, that's shoulder horizontal adduction. And the opposite is horizontal abduction. And you can do the same movements with your hip and it works in exactly the same way. Elbow and knee are much more straightforward because they're a different type of joint. What type of joint are they? Yep, so they're both hinge joints, so a more restrictive, limited range of motion, less likely to do damage or to be dislocated because it's a kind of a more solid joint, but a more limited range of motion. So flexion and extension. Increase in the angle of the joint is extension, that's straightening, and flexion is the decrease in the angle of a joint. Okay, you can't do any other movements at the elbow and knee joint. Okay, then you've got the ankle. So again, classed as a hinge joint, but with two unique names for the joint actions there. So it's not just flexion and extension. Plantar flexion, so pointing the toes away, dorsiflexion, bringing the toes back up towards the knee. Okay, make sure you've got that noted down in a nice neat table, make any corrections to what the work you did previously, and we'll move on. Right, there are a series of 4 short exam questions here, just to kind of round this all up for this session. I'm not going to go through it all now, but what I want you to do is pause the video on the question, write down your answer, and then you're going to move on to the next question. There are 4 questions, and then on the final slide, you get to see the answers. Write down any corrections that you need to put down, and also go back to the question. If you got it wrong, try and work out why you've got it wrong and why it might be another answer. And we'll pick up on this in our next lesson. So that's the first question. Pause it there, read it through, give it a go. Second question, read it through, pause the video, have a go. Third question, pause the video, have a go at your answer. And the fourth one, just a short multiple choice question, but read it through carefully, write down your answer. And then on the next slide, you should see the answers. So just go through each of these, purple pen your own work, just to make sure that you've got a good understanding of it. But I would also encourage you to go back through any of this information which you found a little tricky, some of those new terms, like the horizontal abduction and adduction, the hyperextension, the articulating bones, all of that you need to be very clear on before we start to move on to the other aspects of movement analysis, where we build in the muscular system to this this work that we've done today. Okay, so go back over it, make sure you've got good notes, send me a photo of the work that you've done for today, and we will move on to the next lesson. Okay, cheers guys, thanks a lot.